The Bluest Eye covers so much. There are so many themes in this story that I could talk about. This is a masterpiece. But for this video, the themes I want to talk about the most are the cycles of trauma and abuse. And specifically, I want to talk about Choli. Why is Choli's backstory in this? Why is it important that we understand Choli's backstory? And how can that help us in the future? The Bluest Eye is a book that I read months ago and am still thinking about. I went into this book knowing intellectually that if you oppress a group of people for a couple hundred years, that will have ripple effects for generations. But this book took that to even new levels for me, where it highlights the cycles of trauma and abuse from both outside the community and within the community, and how connected those two things are. In this video, I will be talking about childhood sexual assault, because that is what Choli does to his daughter. It is awful. We know this from the very first couple pages of the book, that Choli is going to sexually abuse his daughter in this book. And it's awful. It's absolutely awful, and there's no justification for it. But we get a section of this book where we hear Choli's story. We see Choli's backstory, and it humanizes Choli to us. Why did Toni Morrison decide to include Choli's backstory in this book? Why did we need to see from someone who is an abuser? What was the purpose to all of this? I think when looking at this story from the themes of trauma and abuse and the cycles that perpetuate, I think it makes Choli's backstory included in this story all the more important. So let's go over a little bit of Choli's backstory. Choli had a fairly rough childhood. Choli was abandoned as a baby and then raised by his aunt. Choli's aunt, while she is a decent caregiver, is not always the most attentive caregiver, and Choli's aunt dies while he is still kind of young. When Choli's aunt dies, he is then on his own. His first sexual encounter ends in humiliation. They are discovered by men out looking for their dogs, and those men decide to humiliate Choli and his partner while they're having their very first sexual encounter. Choli then goes to find his father, whom he has never known, and is rejected by his father. Absolutely none of this is an excuse for Choli's actions towards his daughter. But we get to see a little bit of the trauma Choli has also faced. This really shows the saying, hurt people hurt people. It helps us understand why someone might do such an awful thing. Now, I want to be very clear. Most people who experience trauma and most people who are hurt do not then go on to do the awful things that Choli does, and do not become perpetrators of sexual violence. But those who are abusers have often faced abuse in their past. And maybe the way they're trying to control their life that they feel like is out of control is by controlling others and abusing others around them. That is no justification, but it does explain why it happens. And I think it's very important to understand why something happens if we want to prevent it from happening in the future, if we want to prevent this type of violence from continuing. I read The Bluest Eye as part of like a buddy read along, and I want to read what I wrote at the time that I was finishing The Bluest Eye about Choli's storyline and inclusion in this story. I think trying to humanize Choli was a way to show that things can change and be different. If he was just bad and abusive, then we can condemn him without having to think about what could have led him to be this way. I agree this is not justification, but if we can understand why these things happen, we can work to prevent them from happening again. It's easy to see an abuser and want them punished without actually doing anything to prevent the cycle from continuing. This is one of the reasons I have such a problem with our criminal justice system here in the US and the way people who are caught are talked about online. Usually I see people just calling for the person to be punished, but I don't think punishment solves anything. We need to be calling for systems that promote healing after trauma and reparations for those harmed. We should not absolve Choli for his actions. Choli still had a choice in the matter, and he chose to be the worst kind of person. But if we look at the situation in a compassionate way, maybe if Choli had more support, if Choli had a better outlet for the feelings that he is feeling, if he had a way to deal with these emotions and tools to help him handle these things, maybe that would have prevented him from going on and hurting his daughter the way that he did. And maybe if we want to prevent these things from continuing to happen, if we want to break the cycle, then we need to look at things that we can do in society that support the people who need that outlet for their hurt feelings, not just hurt feelings, but for their trauma. This book has been on my mind for a few months, and definitely the ideas of trauma and abuse and the cycles and how they can just continue for generations has been on my mind. And I've had these ideas about justice on like what justice actually looks like, and just punishing a person as if they are an evil person without recognizing that they need tools to deal with the awfulness that's going on in their life and a better outlet than the awful things that they're currently doing. But also they should not be absolved from responsibility. They still should be held accountable. And I don't have all of the answers for what that looks like, but I think it's important for there to be accountability, for this person to take responsibility for their actions, for there to be reparations, and for them to figure out better ways to deal with the hurt that they are feeling. Maybe we could have better societies and less problems. And I've had some ideas about like criminal justice and the problems with our justice system for a few years now, and I feel like there's been different things that kind of continue to push me in the direction of, we should look at reparations and reconciliation rather than punishment and vengeance on those who commit awful atrocities or even just small atrocities. Maybe we should be looking at better ways to deal with these things. And then there's been a few things recently that kind of pushed me towards looking into prison abolition. And I recently read Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Y. Davis, and I felt like that book was echoing so many of these sentiments that I'm talking about in relation to The Bluest Eye. And I'm just going to read one of the quotes from Are Prisons Obsolete? The prison, therefore, functions ideologically as an abstract site into which the undesirables are deposited, relieving us of the responsibility of thinking about the real issues afflicting these communities from which prisoners are drawn in such disproportionate numbers. This is the ideological work that prison performs. It relieves us of the responsibility of seriously engaging with the problems of our society. And I think this is why Choli's story was included. If we want to imagine a better future, if we want to imagine a future where this does not continue to happen, then we need to find tools as a society to break the cycle and to prevent these things from continuing. And I'm mostly talking about this from a perspective of trauma and abuse. The Bluest Eye talks a lot about racism and different aspects of racism. It examines it from so many different angles. It talks about colorism. I feel like there could be entire discussions just on that and not even on the cycles of trauma and abuse, but like all of these things are woven together. All of these things are interconnected. And if we are going to root these things out and we are going to have better societies, then we need to start seeing all of the connections and really get to root causes instead of treating symptoms, instead of calling certain people, oh, this person's evil, let's just lock them up and act like society is going to be better without actually changing society to be better. Anyways, those are my thoughts on this aspect of The Bluest Eye. This is one of those books that I feel like I can rightfully call life-changing. It has stayed with me. It has affected how I see the world. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about my thoughts. So I hope these were helpful to you, and I hope to see you in another video. Happy reading.